I did not begin walking because I was inspired. I began walking because I was tired, not the kind of tired that sleep can fix, a deeper kind, the kind that settles quietly in your chest, the kind that makes everything feel slightly heavier than it should. I am 58 years old. For most of my life, I believed I was a practical person. I worked, I paid the bills, I showed up when I was needed. I did not complain much, and I did not expect much. But over the past few years, something inside me had grown very quiet. My children had moved out. The house, once full of noise and small arguments and laughter, had become still. Dinner became simpler, conversations became shorter. Even the television sounded louder than it used to. One evening, after washing the dishes, I stood by the kitchen window and watched the sky slowly change color. Soft orange, then pale pink, then blue turning into gray. And I realized I had not been outside during sunset in a very long time. Not really outside, not sitting in traffic, not walking from a parking lot into a store, but outside with no destination, no purpose, just space. That night, without planning it, I put on my old sneakers. They were still by the door, though I had not used them in months. I did not stretch. I did not prepare. I did not track my steps. I simply opened the door and stepped into the evening air. The first few minutes felt awkward. I didn't know where to look. I did not know how fast to walk. I felt slightly foolish, as if someone might ask me where I was going. And I had no answer, but I kept walking. Past the mailbox, past the neighbor's garden, past the corner where children used to wait for the school bus. The air felt cooler than I expected. There was a light breeze. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then stopped. And for the first time that day, I noticed my breathing. Slow, steady, real. I had spent so many years rushing from one responsibility to another that I had forgotten what it felt like to move without urgency. After 10 minutes, I almost turned back. It seemed pointless. What was I accomplishing? Nothing was changing. My problems were still there. My thoughts were still heavy. But I kept going, just a little farther. By the time I reached the end of the street, something small had shifted. Not outside, inside. The noise in my head had softened. It was not gone, but it was quieter. Instead of replaying old conversations, I found myself noticing simple things. The sound of leaves brushing against each other. The way porch lights turned on one by one. The smell of someone cooking dinner. Ordinary details. Details I had lived beside for years without truly seeing. When I returned home 20 minutes later, nothing dramatic had happened. The house looked the same. The sink was still clean. Or the clock still ticked. But I felt slightly different. Not happier, not energized, just lighter. That night, I slept a little better. The next evening, I walked again. Not because I was motivated, but because I was curious. Was yesterday an accident, or had something real happened? The second walk felt less awkward. I knew the route. I knew how long it would take. This time, I walked a little farther. I began to notice patterns. An elderly couple who sat on their porch every evening. A man who watered his lawn with careful attention. A teenage girl practicing basketball in her driveway. Life was happening all around me, and I had been indoors, assuming nothing was changing. On the third evening, it rained lightly. For a moment, I considered skipping the walk. Old habits are comfortable. The couch was warm. The television remote was within reach. But I remembered how I had felt after walking. So I put on a jacket and stepped outside anyway. The rain was gentle, soft drops on my sleeves. The streetlights reflected on the wet pavement. Everything looked slower, calmer, and I realized something surprising. My mind, which had felt crowded for months, was beginning to stretch, not with big solutions, not with life-changing ideas, but with space. Space between thoughts, space between worries, space to breathe. As the days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, that the walks became part of my evenings. I did not announce it to anyone. I did not post about it. I did not measure progress. I simply walked. Sometimes I thought about my children. Sometimes I thought about mistakes I had made. Sometimes I thought about nothing at all. And slowly, something began to shift. I stopped asking, "What is missing?" and started asking, "What is here?" The sound of my footsteps, the changing sky, the quiet rhythm of my breathing. I realized that my mind had been stuck in the past and worried about the future, but my body, moving forward step by step, reminded me of something simple. This moment is enough. One evening, about 3 weeks after I began, I reached the small park at the end of the neighborhood. I had passed it many times before without entering, but that night I walked inside. There was a wooden bench under a large tree. I sat down. The sun was almost gone. The air was cool. And for the first time in a long while, I did not feel like I needed to fix my life. I did not feel behind. I did not feel forgotten. I simply felt present. It was a quiet feeling, but it was powerful. I realized that I had been waiting for something big to change my mood. A new job, a new goal, a new chapter. But instead, change had arrived quietly, in the form of 20 minutes each evening, step by step, breath by breath. Nothing dramatic, nothing impressive, just walking. I do not know where this habit will lead. I do not know if it will solve everything, but I do know this. When I walk, I feel closer to myself, and at this stage of life, that feels important. So tomorrow evening, when the sky begins to turn orange again, I will put on my sneakers, open the door, and walk. By the 4th week, walking was no longer something I had to convince myself to do. It was simply what I did when the sun began to lower itself behind the rooftops. There is something about evening light. It softens everything. Sharp edges blur. Colors become warmer. Even unfinished tasks feel less urgent. I started to notice that my body expected the walk. Around 6:30, I would feel a quiet restlessness, not anxiety, not pressure, just a gentle nudge. Go outside, move, breathe. One evening, I almost ignored it. The day had been long. A small disagreement with my sister had stayed in my mind. Nothing serious. And just words spoken too quickly. Words that lingered longer than they should have. I sat in my chair replaying the conversation, thinking of better responses, imagining different tones. The old habit would have been to stay there, to let the mind circle the same story over and over. But instead, I stood up. I put on my shoes, and I stepped outside with the argument still echoing in my thoughts. At first, the walking did not help. The sentences were still there. Her voice, my voice, and the feeling of being misunderstood. But after 10 minutes, something subtle happened. The rhythm of my steps interrupted the rhythm of my thoughts. Left, right, left, right. The body has its own wisdom. It does not argue. It does not explain. It simply moves forward. And as I walked, I began to see the conversation differently. Not from a place of defense, but from a place of distance. Maybe she was tired. Maybe I was sensitive. Maybe not every misunderstanding needs a winner. By the time I reached the end of my usual route, the sharpness of the moment had softened. The problem was not magically solved, but it no longer felt heavy. That was new for me. In the past, I would carry small conflicts for days. I would analyze them in the shower, rehearse them while driving, return to them before sleep. Now they seem to dissolve somewhere between the mailbox and the park bench. Another change surprised me. I began noticing people more. There was a man about my age who walked his golden retriever every evening. At first, we simply nodded. Then one day he said, "Beautiful night." I smiled and agreed. The next evening, he asked, "You walk every day?" I said yes. He said he started after retiring last year. He laughed softly and said, "If I don't move, my mind moves too much." That sentence stayed with me. If I don't move, my mind moves too much. It was true. When my body stayed still for too long, my thoughts became louder. When I moved, they seemed to find their place. We began exchanging a few words each evening. Nothing deep, nothing personal, just small human moments. Weather, dogs, how fast the year was passing. And yet, those small conversations made the neighborhood feel less anonymous. I was not just a person inside a house, I was someone walking under the same sky as others. One evening, as I passed the teenage girl practicing basketball again, she missed a shot and sighed loudly. Without thinking, I said, "You'll get the next one." She smiled politely. She did not know that I was also speaking to myself. "You'll get the next one." That became a quiet phrase in my mind. When I felt impatient with myself, when I felt regret about something I had not done earlier in life, "You'll get the next one." Walking began to feel less like exercise and more like a gentle conversation with myself, a conversation without judgment, without pressure. I noticed my breathing had changed too. It was deeper now, slower, as if my body trusted that there was time. One evening, I tried something different. Instead of listening to music or letting my thoughts wander freely, I focused only on what I could see: the shape of clouds, the cracks in the sidewalk, the way light reflected off car windows. At first, it felt forced, but after a few minutes, it became natural. The world was detailed in ways I had forgotten. A small purple flower growing through a fence, an elderly woman carefully arranging wind chimes on her porch, a child's chalk drawing fading slowly on the pavement. Life was not dramatic, it was layered, and I had been living too fast to notice. As weeks passed, my mood began to stabilize in a quiet way. I was not suddenly joyful, but I was less reactive, less restless. There was more space between feeling and response. One afternoon, my son called. He sounded stressed about work. Normally, I would immediately offer solutions, advice, corrections, but that day something in me was calmer. I listened, really listened. And when he finished speaking, I simply said, "That sounds heavy." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, it is." We did not solve anything, but the conversation felt more honest. Later, during my walk, I thought about that moment. Maybe walking had not only changed my mind, maybe it had softened it. I was less eager to fix, less eager to control, more willing to allow. One evening, I skipped the walk because of heavy rain. I told myself it was reasonable, and it was. But I noticed something. My thoughts that night felt tighter, my patience thinner. The next day, I walked again, even though the ground was still damp, and the difference was clear. It was not about discipline. It was about care. I was beginning to see the walk as an act of kindness toward myself, not productivity, not improvement, and just care. At this stage of life, care feels different. It is not about ambition, It is about balance. It is about tending to the quiet corners of the mind that often go ignored. Sometimes during my walks, I think about aging, about how society often speaks about it in terms of decline, slower, weaker, less relevant. But walking each evening reminds me of something else. I am still capable of change, still capable of growth, still capable of noticing beauty. That realization feels quietly rebellious, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. A few days ago, as I reached the park bench again, I sat down and watched the sky shift from gold to blue. I felt something I had not felt in a long time: contentment, not because everything was perfect, but because I was present. I did not need the day to be different. I did not need to be younger. I did not need to solve tomorrow. I just needed to sit there, breathing, watching, existing. And I understood something simple. The walks were not changing my life in big, visible ways. They were changing the way I experienced my life, slowly, gently, step by step. Tomorrow evening, I will walk again. Not because I have to, but because I want to see what my mind will become next. Somewhere around the sixth week, I stopped counting the days. The walks were no longer new. They were no longer an experiment. They had quietly become part of the structure of my life. Like brushing my teeth, like making coffee in the morning. Simple, ordinary, expected. And yet something deeper was unfolding beneath that simplicity. One evening, as I walked past the familiar row of houses, I noticed a for sale sign in front of a home that had always seemed permanent. An older couple had lived there for as long as I could remember. Their porch light was always on. Their garden was always neat. Seeing that sign felt strange, a reminder that nothing stays exactly the same. For a moment, a wave of sadness moved through me. Change has always unsettled me, even good change, even necessary change. I kept walking, but my thoughts lingered on that house. How many dinners had they shared inside? How many arguments? How many quiet mornings with coffee by the window? Life gathers in places, and then one day it moves on. As I turned the corner, I realized something. In the past, that kind of thought would have stayed with me for hours. I would have attached it to my own fears, aging, loss, uncertainty. But now, the feeling passed more gently. I acknowledged it. I breathed with it. And then I let my eyes return to the street ahead. Walking was teaching me something subtle about impermanence: not to resist it so fiercely, not to grip so tightly, just to notice and continue moving. A few nights later, I experienced something unexpected. Halfway through my route, I felt a sudden heaviness in my chest. Not physical pain, just emotion. It arrived without a clear reason, a quiet ache. I slowed my pace. I could have turned back. I could have distracted myself. But instead, I kept walking. And I asked myself a simple question: what are you feeling? The answer surprised me: loneliness. Not dramatic loneliness, not desperate loneliness. Just the quiet awareness that my life looked very different than it once did. And the house was quieter, the phone rang less often. The roles I once played every day, parent, organizer, problem solver, were no longer needed in the same way. For a long time, I had filled my identity with usefulness. If someone needed something, I was there. If something was broken, I fixed it. But who was I when no one was asking? That question had been sitting quietly in me for months, maybe years, and walking, with its steady rhythm and open space, finally gave it room to speak. I did not try to answer immediately. I just walked with the question: left, right, Left, right. There is something powerful about allowing a question to exist without rushing to solve it. By the time I reached the park, the heaviness had softened, not because I found clarity, but because I had listened. And that felt new. In my younger years, I rarely listened to myself. I listened to deadlines, to expectations, to other people's needs, but my own inner voice often had to wait. Now, in the quiet of the evening, it had space. One night, I decided to take a different route. Instead of turning right at the corner, I turned left. It felt strangely adventurous, a small rebellion against routine. The street was unfamiliar. Different houses, different trees, different sounds. At first, I felt slightly uncomfortable. I did not know where it would lead. But as I continued, I realized something. I had been craving this small uncertainty, not chaos, not upheaval, just a reminder that I could still choose a new direction. We often think change must be dramatic to matter: a new career, a new city, a new relationship. But sometimes change begins with turning left instead of right. As I walked down the unfamiliar street, I noticed a small community garden tucked between two houses. I had never seen it before. Raised wooden beds filled with vegetables, tomatoes, herbs, bright green leaves catching the last light of the day. And a woman about my age was watering the plants. She smiled when she saw me looking. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. I nodded. We spoke for a few minutes. She told me the garden had started during the pandemic. Neighbors wanted something to care for together, something hopeful, something alive. As I walked away, I felt inspired not to start a garden necessarily, but to remember that new things can grow at any stage of life. That conversation stayed with me long after I returned home. Over the next few days, I noticed another shift inside myself. I was less critical of others, of myself. If I forgot something small, I did not scold myself as harshly. If someone spoke sharply, I did not assume it was about me. There was more space, more patience. I began to understand that walking was not only calming my thoughts, it was expanding my perspective. When you move forward physically, even at a slow pace, and something inside you begins to believe that forward movement is possible in other ways too. One evening, as I passed the golden retriever again, the man walking him seemed distracted. He mentioned that his wife had a minor health scare. "Nothing serious," he said, but enough to remind him that time feels more fragile now. We walked side by side for a few minutes, in silence, not the uncomfortable kind, the steady kind. Before we parted, he said, "I'm glad I started walking last year. It gives me space to think without panicking." I understood exactly what he meant. Space without panic. That felt like a gift. Aging brings many realizations. Some are difficult, the body changes, energy shifts, certain dreams quietly close. But walking each evening was teaching me that not everything narrows with age. Some things widen. Awareness, compassion, depth. I began to see my life less as a list of accomplishments and more as a landscape. There were valleys, there were hills, there were seasons of growth and seasons of rest. And right now, I was in a season of quiet observation, and that was enough. One particularly cool evening, I arrived at the park bench and did not sit immediately. Instead, I stood and looked at the sky. The colors were layered, orange fading into purple, then into deep blue. I realized I had watched this transformation dozens of times now, and yet it never felt repetitive, because I was different each time. Some evenings I was thoughtful, some evenings calm, some evenings slightly restless. The sky changed, and so did I. That awareness felt grounding. I did not need to return to who I was at 30 or 40 or even 50. I could simply be who I was at 58, walking in the evening light, breathing in cool air, feeling both the weight and the gift of time. As I made my way home that night, I understood something clearly. These walks were not solving my life. They were reshaping my relationship with it. I was less afraid of empty space, less resistant to quiet, less desperate to fill every moment with noise. Instead, I was learning to inhabit my own company, to trust it, to appreciate it. Tomorrow, I might take the familiar route again, or I might turn left once more. I do not need to decide now. The evening will come, the sky will change color, and I will step outside, not searching for something dramatic, not expecting transformation, just willing to walk and see what gently unfolds next. There was a night when I almost did not go. It had been a long day. Nothing dramatic had happened, but everything felt slightly off. A short phone call that ended too quickly. An old memory that appeared without warning. A strange restlessness I could not explain. The sky was already turning gray when I looked at my shoes by the door. For a few minutes, I stood there, listening to the quiet of the house, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the small sounds that become louder when life slows down. A part of me said, "It's okay to skip tonight." And it was true. One evening would not erase the habit, but another part of me understood something important. The nights I least wanted to walk were often the nights I needed it most. So I put on my jacket, slipped into my sneakers, and stepped outside. The air was colder than usual and sharp against my cheeks. The street looked different under the early darkness. Fewer people, fewer lights, more shadows. At first, my thoughts felt heavy. They circled around the same questions. What am I doing with this stage of my life? Is this enough? Should I be striving for something more? These questions used to frighten me. They felt like accusations, like proof that I was falling behind. But as I walked, I noticed something subtle. The questions were still there, but they no longer sounded harsh. They sounded curious, gentle, almost like a quiet conversation with myself. I slowed my pace, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to listen carefully. For many years, I believed productivity was the same as worth. If I was busy, I was valuable. If I was needed, I mattered. But walking had begun to loosen that belief. Out here, no one needed me to solve anything. No one expected answers. I was simply a person moving through the evening. And somehow, that felt honest. As I reached the park, I noticed the bench was empty. The tree above it swayed slightly in the wind. I sat down and wrapped my hands around each other to stay warm, and I allowed myself to think about something I had been avoiding: retirement. The word had been floating around in conversations lately. Friends discussing plans, savings, trips, downsizing. I had nodded politely when the topic came up, but inside I felt unsure. Who would I be without the structure of work? Without a schedule? Without deadlines? The idea felt both freeing and unsettling. Sitting there in the cold air, I realized something. Walking had already begun to prepare me. It had given me a new kind of structure, not imposed from outside, but chosen. Each evening, I decided to step out, to move, to breathe, to reflect. That small act of choice had slowly rebuilt my confidence, not loud confidence, not bold declarations, but quiet trust, trust that I could shape my days in simple ways. On my way home, I passed the house with the "for sale" sign again. The lights inside were on. Boxes were visible through the window. Life in transition. And instead of feeling only sadness, I felt a surprising sense of respect. Change requires courage, even when it is necessary, even when it is overdue. The next few evenings were calmer. The cold air remained, but I adjusted. I wore thicker socks, a warmer scarf. I noticed how the body adapts when given time, and I began to see how the mind does the same. One evening, I brought my phone with me, thinking I might listen to music, but after a few minutes, I turned it off. The silence felt more valuable. There is a different quality to silence outdoors. It is not empty. It is layered. Distant traffic, wind through branches, a gate closing softly somewhere down the street. These sounds do not demand attention. They simply exist, and in their presence, my own thoughts seemed less overwhelming. I began experimenting with gratitude, not forced gratitude, not a long list, just one thing each walk, one detail I genuinely appreciated. The warmth of my gloves, the steady rhythm of my steps, the fact that my legs carried me without pain, small things, but real. Over time, this practice changed the tone of my inner voice. It became less critical, less impatient, more balanced. I was not ignoring problems. I was simply widening the frame, allowing both difficulty and goodness to exist together. One evening, as I approached the community garden again, I saw new winter plants being prepared. The woman I had spoken to before was there with two neighbors. They were clearing old leaves, turning soil, preparing for another season. I watched quietly for a moment before continuing on, and I realized something important. Growth does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like clearing space, removing what is no longer needed, making room for what might come. That idea stayed with me long after the walk ended. Back at home, I looked around my living room. Shelves filled with items I had not touched in years, papers stacked in drawers, clothes I no longer wore. Perhaps my life, like that garden, needed a little clearing, not because something was wrong, but because space allows new energy to enter. Walking had begun as a simple attempt to ease my mind, but it was quietly influencing other parts of my life. I began decluttering one drawer each weekend, nothing extreme, just thoughtful, intentional. And with each cleared space, I felt a similar lightness inside. The outer environment and the inner world are not separate. They reflect each other more than we realize. As the weeks passed, something else shifted. I stopped measuring progress. In the beginning, I had wondered, is this working? Am I improving? But now the question felt unnecessary. The walks were not a project, they were a rhythm, a steady pulse in my days. Some evenings felt reflective, some felt ordinary, some felt slightly restless, but none felt wasted. Even on the nights when my thoughts returned to old regrets, there was a difference. The regrets no longer swallowed me. They passed through like clouds, visible, temporary, and then moving on. One particularly clear evening, the sky was filled with stars. I had forgotten how many were visible when the air was crisp. I stood still for several minutes, looking up, feeling small in a comforting way. There is peace in recognizing that life is vast, that our individual worries, though real, are part of something much larger. Walking had not removed uncertainty from my life, but it had changed my relationship with it. Uncertainty no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like open space, possibility, room to choose gently, day by day. As I approached my front door that night, I paused before going inside. The house was still quiet, still familiar, but I was not entering it with the same heaviness I once carried. I was bringing in fresh air, fresh perspective, and a quiet strength that had grown almost without my noticing. Tomorrow will come with its own questions, its own small challenges. But when evening arrives, as it always does, I will lace up my shoes again, not because walking solves everything, but because it reminds me that I am still moving, still adapting, still capable of beginning again, one quiet step at a time. There was a morning, not an evening, when I realized something had truly changed. I woke up before my alarm. The room was still dim, soft light resting gently against the curtains. For a few seconds, I stayed still, listening to my breathing, and I noticed something unfamiliar. There was no immediate rush of thoughts, no long list of worries waiting at the door of my mind, just quiet, not empty, but steady. That quiet had once felt uncomfortable to me, like something was missing. Now, it felt earned. I got out of bed slowly and walked to the kitchen. As I made coffee, I found myself looking forward to the evening, not because something exciting was planned, but because I knew I would walk. And that simple expectation brought calm. It surprised me how much security could come from something so small. Later that day, I met an old friend for lunch. We had not seen each other in months. She looked at me carefully across the table and said, "You seem different." I smiled. "Different how?" "Quieter," she said, but not in a sad way, in a steady way. I did not know exactly how to respond, because the change had been gradual, like the sky changing color at sunset. You do not see it shift in one moment, but suddenly, it is night. I told her about the walks, how they had started without intention, how they had slowly become a kind of anchor. She nodded thoughtfully. "I've been feeling stuck lately," she admitted. I did not give her advice. I did not suggest she start walking too. I simply shared what I had learned. That movement creates space, and space allows clarity. When we parted ways, I felt grateful, not because I had solved anything for her, but because I had something real to offer. And not solutions, but presence. The evenings continued. Winter slowly softened into early signs of spring. The air was less sharp. Birds began returning to the trees. The neighborhood felt subtly alive again. One evening, as I walked past the house that had been for sale, I saw new curtains in the window, new lights, a different car in the driveway. Life had moved forward, and instead of nostalgia, I felt acceptance. Everything changes, and we change with it. The community garden was preparing for planting. Fresh soil turned carefully, new seeds waiting for warmth. I stopped and spoke again with the woman who had first told me its story. She asked how my walks were going. I told her they had become part of me now. She smiled and said, "It's funny how the smallest habits reshape us." That sentence stayed with me. Reshape, not replace, not transform into someone else. Just reshape, refine the edges, soften the hard corners. I realized I no longer walked to escape my thoughts. I walked to meet them. And often, they were kinder than I expected. There were still evenings when doubt appeared, when questions about aging surfaced, when I wondered if I should be doing more, achieving more. But those thoughts no longer carried urgency. They arrived, they sat beside me, and then they drifted away. Because I had learned something essential. Not every thought deserves action. Some thoughts only need acknowledgement. As spring approached fully, I changed my route again, longer this time, adding an extra block, then another. My legs felt stronger, my breathing deeper. I was not training for anything, but my body responded to consistency, and my mind mirrored that strength. I began waking earlier, reading more, spending less time scrolling through news that left me unsettled. Instead, I found comfort in routine, in slowness. It's in choosing what enters my mind carefully. One evening, I reached the park bench and found it occupied by a young man staring at his phone. He looked anxious, restless. I considered turning back, but instead I sat on the grass a few feet away. The sky was bright with pink and gold. After a few minutes, he glanced up and noticed the colors. He put his phone down, and for a brief moment, we both watched in silence. No words exchanged, but something shared. That is another thing walking taught me. Presence is contagious. When you slow down, sometimes others slow down too. As I made my way home that night, I understood something clearly. The walks had not changed my circumstances. My children still lived their own lives. My career was still nearing its natural transition. The house was still quiet, but my relationship to these facts had softened. I no longer saw quiet as emptiness. I saw it as space. Space to rediscover parts of myself that had been waiting patiently. There was a version of me beneath the roles, beneath the expectations, beneath the noise, and evening after evening, step after step, I had been meeting that person again. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. One quiet step at a time. Tonight, as I stand by the door again, sneakers in hand, I pause for a moment. Not out of hesitation, but out of gratitude. Gratitude that I listened to the small impulse that first evening. Gratitude that I did not dismiss it as meaningless. Gratitude that I kept going, even on the nights I wanted to stay inside. If you are listening to this story and feeling heavy or restless or unsure of where you stand in your own life, perhaps you do not need a grand solution. Perhaps you do not need to reinvent everything. Perhaps you only need a small, consistent step, a quiet ritual, a gentle movement forward. It does not have to be walking. It can be anything that returns you to yourself, but choose something simple, something repeatable, something kind, and allow it to reshape you slowly. This journey began with 20 minutes at sunset. It became clarity, strength, acceptance, and peace I did not know I was missing. Tomorrow evening, I will walk again. Not because I must, but because I want to. Because in those quiet streets, under changing skies, I found my way back to my own steady mind. Thank you for walking with me through this story. If it brought you calm, or reflection, or even just a slower breath, I am grateful you were here. And if you would like more gentle stories to listen to in the evening, I will be here, one quiet step at a time.